On this week's Live with Littlewood, will a lockdown extension our economy into a tailspin? Will foreign aid targets and global taxes really lift the poorest in the world out of poverty? And what should we make of the great UK-EU sausage spat? All of that on this week's Live with Littlewood. Kaboom, kapow, boom shakalaka. Welcome to this week's episode of Live with Littlewood. Thank you for joining me, Mark Littlewood, Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, for a free market look at the big issues of the week. Coming up on this week's show, the G7 summit kicks off this week. Wealthy nations are discussing minimum global tax rates, and conservative rebels are fixating on the foreign aid budget. But we'll be asking, is this really a good strategy on supporting poorer countries? Relations are sizzling once again between the UK and the European Union, this time over sausages and indeed other cold meats being transferred from mainland Britain to Northern Ireland. Should we worry that this could make our relationship go out with a bang or banger? You can now support the IA on Patreon, where we have set up a membership platform that allows our followers to donate solely towards our digital work, while subscribing as an online patron to exclusive IA perks, benefits, priority access to our content, and much, much more. If you'd like the opportunity to directly help us at the IA continue producing stimulating educational online free market content, head over to patreon.com/IA London, or follow the link in the chat or in the video description below. Now that's out of the way, on with our first segment of the show. I'm delighted this evening to be joined once again by Brendan O'Neill, editor of Spiked. Good evening, Brendan. How are you?
Hi, Mark. I'm good, thanks.
Great to have you with us. The IA's very own head of regulatory affairs, Victoria Hewson. Good evening, Victoria. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Mark.
And delighted also to be joined by James Price, former Conservative Special Advisor, former President of the Oxford Union, all-round good egg. James, how are you this evening?
I've been called a lot worse than that. Thanks very much.
It will get worse as the show goes on, I promise you, James, I promise you. So Matt Hancock has claimed the government is, quote, absolutely open to delaying England's unlocking. He also said in January that once the majority of vulnerable people were protected, we could cry freedom. With over 3/4 of people jabbed once and half of us twice, are we really going to backtrack on what is already a painfully slow roadmap? We're calling this section of the show From Lockdown to Economic Meltdown. I'm going to be asking people whether they think we'll get our freedoms back on June the 21st, and whether if we don't, the very DNA of our economy will start to erode if there are any further delays. Brendan, let me start with you. Are you crying freedom, or are you just crying at the state of lockdowns here in the UK?
I'm crying mainly. I think it will be an unmitigated disaster if the 21st of June doesn't happen, if Freedom Day is cancelled. And, you know, there are a number of reasons for this. Firstly, it will do significant damage to the economy. We've already done a huge amount of damage to the economy over the past year, and we will do more in the 2 or 4 weeks extension that might be added onto the lockdown. Small businesses will go under, hospitality sector will suffer. So that will be terrible. But even worse than that, the thing that concerns me most at the moment is that I think some British people are losing the knack for freedom. You know, I'm seeing lots of reports now about people feeling social anxiety about going back into the real world, feeling that they were comfortable in the lockdown, comfortable in their cave mentality, as some therapists are referring to it. And there is a reluctance to embrace freedom, to embrace the restoration of liberty. And I think what we have to recognize is that during the pandemic, we had an unprecedented redefinition of the relationship between the state and the individual. The state accrued enormous powers to tell us what we could do, when you could leave. clampdown on everyday freedoms. Some people thought that was necessary, other people disagree. But the point surely now is that all of us should agree that we have to have those freedoms returned to us. And the fact that polls are suggesting that people feel uncomfortable, and the fact that the political class is holding out and saying, well, not just yet, that should worry everyone who cares about freedom.
Yeah, it's interesting now, because obviously, freedom doesn't mean you're forced to go down the pub. It just means you can if you want to. I guess if people want to stay in their man caves, they can. Victoria, let me come to you. We've had lots of internal debates about lockdown approaches here at the IEA. You've been pretty consistently on the lockdown skeptic wing of that argument. You must be crying rather than crying freedom, I'm guessing. But tell me this, Victoria, have your sort of more pessimistic predictions about the encroachment of the state into individual liberty been proven right? Because it seems to me now you could have had, I don't know, going back to January or the start of this ghastly pandemic, you could have had an argument about, whether you really were saving lives. But the numbers are now so low. What does it say about our state if lockdowns are justified with the sort of infection rates or fatality rates that we're seeing for COVID? And then it seems that they could be justified for almost anything else. What's your take, Victoria?
Right, and let's be very clear as well that what happens on the 21st of June is not a full restitution of our freedoms. There are still going to be lots of quite potentially what feel like quite petty minor restrictions persisting. But if you are, say, running a pub, the fact that you can't have people come and stand at the bar is quite a serious impediment to running your business. And even now, a lot of people are saying, oh, well, what are you so worried about? If we delay 21st of June a little bit longer, we're basically back to normal now anyway, aren't we? But 25% of pubs have not yet reopened. 25% of people who work in the arts and entertainment are still on furlough. This is not normal. And, these kinds of petty restrictions that will not just dull people's ability to efficiently run a small business in the hospitality trade, but also just be a more general reminder of the encroachment of the state in our lives. For example, there's no suggestion yet that the mask mandate is going to be repealed on the 21st of June. That's going to still be there as a constant reminder that we should be fearful and worried and kind of suspicious about each other. And so that's very worrying. In terms of the economic costs as well, I was just reading a paper by a very distinguished economist from Imperial College, where else, who has done the cost benefit analysis that the government never got around to doing. And he worked out that the restrictions this year, just since January, have cost £400,000, conservatively £400,000 per life year saved. The NHS usually works on the basis that 30,000 is about what they would wish to spend per life year saved. That's more than 10 times our normal tolerance for the GDP cost of saving lives. Now, that's not to value money over lives, but it's just to give a flavour of the kind of proportionality or lack of proportionality that we are now working under.
Yeah. James, let me come to you. What do you make of this? Do you think, as Victoria has said, that we've become even more irrational about risk? There are risks from all sorts of things, and we've become just peculiar obsessed about this risk, which thankfully is obviously a receding one. And what about Brendan's point? I find this really interesting, that in a kind of social or cultural way, are we losing our freedom muscles? We've kind of just now got used to this bizarre dystopian way of living, and might actually the return to freedom not be welcome. I mean, it's a bit like all these stories you hear of people who sometimes defect from North Korea and can't cope with the free world outside of North Korea. We're all becoming little North Koreans here, do you think, James?
I do hope not. I mean, first of all, I think it's very mean of Victoria to mention Imperial College London. Presumably the name of Imperial is going to be changed very soon. It's very, very cruel to be mentioning such words like that. Well, I think the problem is that we've got to a situation now where in this weird halfway house, we've become so grateful for it. I know it looks like I'm in some sort of cave and my captors are treating me well here, and I'm therefore going to use the reference of Stockholm Syndrome. But because we've been given some of our freedoms back, and we're meant to feel grateful for all of this. And I am very lucky. I'm sat in an office now, not at home for the first time in a very long time. And it does feel like a little slice of heaven. And I think the reason that we can go back into offices is a slight sop to the fact that that's certainly better for the economy. And of course, all the people that make these rules have been allowed to go into the office all the way through. And I think that's another thing that politicians haven't really had any of their freedoms curtailed, nor, by the way, have journalists. And that we're sort of meant to therefore feel grateful for all of this. And just before this, I was stood queuing to go inside a pub where I had to wear a mask, but then if I sat down in that pub, I could take the mask off again, and all these sorts of arbitrary rules. And we're meant to feel grateful for it. And every time I've been on Live with Littlewood previously, I've been incredibly optimistic about how everything is going to bounce back. My slight concern now is that, as you say, we've been conditioned for this. And as Brendan says, we're going to forget really what true freedom feels like. And it's like, rather than being in whatever cave I'm in now, we're stuck in Plato's cave and we don't know the true joy of life anymore.
James, I'm just delighted we managed to get a Wi-Fi connection into your padded cell. That's the wonders of modern technology, and I'm glad that's holding up.
It's the 5G sound from my vaccine.
Brendan, you suggested that we're sort of losing our freedom instincts, our freedom muscles, our freedom reflexes. Let me turn on to the sort of economic side of the question here. My sort of theory would go that each day of lockdown is worse for the economy than the previous one. That it's actually a kind of exponential pain on the economy. Probably most people or businesses could cope with, I don't know, a power cut over 24 hours if that led to a one day of lockdown. But do you think, Brendan, you get to a stage where the economy starts to see its DNA degrade, if you will? I mean, it's only one snapshot, but I think you've seen only about 25% of pubs are confident that they'll make it through the summer. A report today estimates that 30 licensed premises a day have been closing since December 2019. Obviously, Brendan, there isn't a kind of absolute cutoff point, but do you think we are approaching some sort of generic tipping point where lots of businesses and workers who otherwise would have made it through, suddenly they can't quite make this last hurdle that they really needed things to open over a few weeks ago, or pray to God that they do actually open fully on June 21st?
Absolutely. And, that one of the most bizarre things about the lockdown, the thing that I found most curious was the lockdown left. You had all these leftists cheering the lockdown on. They thought it was socialism or something. They thought it was, their ideal society. Maybe it was, which tells us a lot about those kinds of people. But the thing that they could never take on board, or they refused to take on board, was the fact that vast corporations did very well during lockdown. The Amazons of the world have boosted their profits and become even richer than they were before. But smaller businesses and local pubs and hospitality outlets, they have been absolutely pummeled. They cannot go on for very long at all. They certainly can't go on for 18 months without any real income, real dynamic income. So lots of those have already closed. That includes a pub near where I live, which I used to love, which is no longer there, which makes me peculiarly angry. I think I'm visiting all my lockdown anger on the closure of this one pub. And it's those smaller businesses and smaller pubs and local shops that have suffered, and many have closed. So it's devastating. But I think you're right. It also will change the DNA of the economy. It will change how we think about economic life. Now, it could potentially have changed that for the good. Perhaps there could have been a bit of creative destruction. Perhaps we could have swept aside in a careful, measured way some of the businesses and zombie businesses and that were not doing very well. But I think actually we're going to have a bad form of change in relation to the economy. I think we're going to become more cavalier about the economy and how important it is. We've already seen people saying that ridiculous thing that, you have to choose between the economy and lives, as if the economy isn't also lives in terms of livelihoods, the way people earn money, the way people develop a sense of esteem in their lives. We know that when people work and earn, they live longer, they're healthier, they're happier. So the devastation of the economy will also, in the long term, lead to a devastation on health and life and outlook. So I hope people start to appreciate how central a healthy, functioning economy is to a modern capitalist society. My fear is that the culture of fear is now so pronounced that people won't even care about things like economic life. They will just care about hiding away from dangers.
Victoria, what's your audit of the economic damage in the private sector? Do you think Brendan and I are right that there is a sort of series of tipping points, if you like, and each delay becomes worse than the previous one? I mean, I can't even get my head around how any pub has sort of survived the last 12 years. But I'm sort of amazed the figures aren't worse. But what's your rough audit, Victoria, of the devastation on the private sector and your optimism about bounce back ability? Do you share some of Brendan's pessimism here that perhaps we aren't just going to storm back into something like normal, bustling, buccaneering life on June the 21st?
Well, you mentioned that you used the word bounce back. Of course, the bounce back loans that were paid out to small businesses to try and see them through cash flow problems, etc., through the shutdown, they're going to start falling due. Lots of small businesses, something I think the Office of Budget Responsibility said they estimate something like 40% of the small businesses who took out these loans are just not going to be able to repay them, so that's going to be a very long drawn out process. You can see a lot of disputes and bankruptcies coming in connection with that as well, which all just shows really when you invite the state into your business, you can't get them out very easily again. And then there's the life chances of children who've had their education disrupted, of young people who were just entering the workplace who've had their progress and learning and training at work disrupted, never mind the people who are losing their jobs. The scarring effects of all of that will go on for many years to come. And I think this just goes to show really something that, of course, what we at the IAA have known for generations, that you can't just dial up and dial down the economy on command from the Chancellor's office. That's just not how it works. And even if you throw billions and billions of pounds at it, a capitalist market economy does not work like that.
James, what's your take? You're usually, when you're on this show, the chirpiest, most optimistic chappy imaginable. Brendan, Victoria, and myself are being pretty morose here. Cheer us up about the potential for bounce back, James, from your padded cell in Belmarsh.
I do think there's a lot of potential for bounce back. So I've seen clients have various different kind of lockdowns. Some of them have had quite good ones. You've mentioned some big companies have done quite well out of this, and lots of other ones have really struggled. Mark, you said that you weren't sure how it was that some pubs had survived this long. And a lot of it has been a lot of support that people like Rishi Sunak have given. That furlough scheme has saved an awful lot of jobs in the long run and businesses and things like that. And it was sort of invented almost overnight in a bit of a rush. And it's quite an impressive achievement in its way. The problem is when that sort of furlough morphine runs off and we do get the final reopening, and you'll see the favourite pub of Brendan's and all these other places that don't come back again, we'll start to see some of the effects of it. And Victoria, again, very wisely says the long-term effects on people's education. The problem is that we're not going to be seeing all of the damages of all this for a long time. But I think when we do, and the magic money tree finally does wither in the form of furlough and anything else, someone like Rishi Sunak really does realise that we're going to have to grow our way out of these problems. And therefore, I think in some ways, pro-free market policies of the kind that the IEA put forward are going to be the only option available to us in order to stave off complete and utter economic catastrophe. And what I think it means as well is that the fight is still there to be won to remind people that freedom is more fun and more rewarding, and that people are not going to be able to hide away in caves like this or cells for very long. And so I think that the fight is still there to be won, and we haven't lost it yet.
Let me just ask each of you in turn before we move on to our next topic, quite apart from what you want to happen, what you actually think will happen. Victoria rightly says that actually June the 21st is not slated as being the complete repeal of all restrictions. But from what the government's put forward on its roadmap, Brendan, do you think they're going to stick with June the 21st? I know that's not the full and complete return of all of our cherished liberties, but do you think we'll even get that package? Or are you concerned about reports that could be kicked down the road? I don't know, another fortnight has been suggested.
I find it so hard to read them at the moment in terms of what they're thinking. My instinct is that they will go for the 21st of June. That's my instinct. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic there, but I completely agree with James. Whatever they do on the 21st of June, the fight to encourage an appreciation for the free life and for being in charge of your life, for being a self-governing individual, that's going to, if anything, that's only going to start on the 21st of June. The 21st of June would be a good day if we open up more, but it will only be the start of the fight for an appreciation of freedom.
Victoria, what are you expecting? More delay or the meaningful start of freedom returning on June 21st?
So I think I would still probably be reasonably confident that they will stick with the plan for the 21st of June. If they don't, though, let's be very clear, that won't be because of data and science. It would be a pure political move, just so they could be absolutely sure that they couldn't be criticised in the future in case there is another surge in cases.
But that's going to apply forever, right? I mean,
Yes,
that's no easier on July the 5th or whatever, from what I can see. James, what's your view on this? Will we get this? I mean, it's been in my view, too slow and ponderous a roadmap out, but at least thus far they have taken us through the gates that they said they were going to take us through. Are they going to get over this hurdle or fall at it?
I was going to be the pessimist and suggest there was going to be some kind of horrible fudge going on. But if Brendan and Victoria seem to be more confident than me, I can't be outdone on this. I think the truth is that with the G7 and everything going on that we'll be coming on to talk about, I suspect in a bit, the Prime Minister hasn't made up his mind on it yet. The decision will be made probably next Monday for a week's time. And depending on what the numbers look like then, there'll be a snap call, because that's how politics is done. It's not data or dates or anything else. It's what it looks like on the day. And I think that the lag of people with antibodies will be even better. The number of people being vaccinated will be even better. And when obviously England win their first game in the Euros on Sunday, then people will be feeling a lot more optimistic about it, and we'll get some more relaxation on the 21st.
Well, I'm one of the lucky ones who's got a ticket to go to Wembley for England-Scotland on Friday week. One of the few fans who will get in. But I've got to have a vaccine passport to get into the stadium, they've just told me yesterday. So that's going to be a bundle of fun. Stay with us, the three of you. Let's move on to our next topic. We're calling this next section of tonight's show Bangers and Clash. I mean, if I read everything in my script here, there's going to be so many corny puns. I'll warn you, the three of you and all of the guys watching, and my apologies in advance for that. But look, there's been tensions really over the Northern Ireland Protocol since it was first signed. A new row's broken out over transporting chilled meats from mainland Britain to Northern Ireland. And despite a meeting today between the UK and the EU negotiating teams, no deal has been reached, and it looks like the conflict might escalate. Victoria, let me start with you. You've written extensively on the Northern Ireland Protocol, highly technical, rather complex piece of legislation. I'm not sure I can completely get my head around it, but am I right to say that the problem is this, that we've kind of half welded in Northern Ireland into the European single market? So we've created a border within the United Kingdom. Weren't matters of this nature almost certain to arise? I mean, nobody should be surprised, right?
Yes and no. So I think your basic factual analysis is about right. Northern Ireland is effectively in the single market for goods, not services, but for goods. And obviously that includes food and agriculture, which is where the EU has some of its most stringent border controls. However, where I think it's not as clear-cut as simply saying the UK is reneging on what we agreed. For a start, the UK has invested billions in making the border work as it is at present. There are huge systems in place, and traders and HMRC and you know, their sort of whole sort of customs supply chain has been revolutionized for trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So that shouldn't be underestimated. The UK has done an awful lot already to try and make this work. Where the current flare-up is happening is about chilled food products, chilled meat products to be precise. And the problem here is that the EU has a total blanket ban on the import of chilled meat products into the single market from anywhere in the world. And so if you want to import meat into the single market, it has to be frozen, end of, from anywhere. And so when you have the situation where Northern Ireland is an integral part of the UK single market, its supermarkets and catering suppliers are part of UK-wide supply chains. When this negotiated grace period expires, in fact, it already has expired and we've already unilaterally extended it once, you just won't be able to buy sauce, chilled food, sausages, meat, ready meals from Great Britain at all. This isn't just a case of dealing with the extra formalities, it's just an outright ban. Now, and yes, in fairness, they were the rules, we knew what they were when we signed up, but the protocol includes provisions whereby the parties, the UK and the EU, are supposed to be using their best endeavours to facilitate trade between Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom. Now, we always knew the protocol was extremely complex and we'd need a lot of work to put it into practice. And that's why there were these committees set up, so that the two sides could work together to make it work with as little impact on the people of Northern Ireland, and in particular with an eye on the peace process as possible. And so for the EU to now sit back on the legal defaults under the agreement and refuse any flexibilities whatsoever, unless of course the UK as a whole agrees to bind ourselves to align to EU laws, I'm not sure that quite counts as best endeavours to facilitate trade.
Brendan, what's your take on this? You were saying in the first section of the show, Brendan, that we're sort of, the appetite or tolerance to risk seems to have completely collapsed. Isn't this true in this sort of instance as well? Whatever the specific rules are, isn't there a major problem that we're just being completely risk averse? Is the precautionary principle gone mad, isn't it?
Well, that was always one of the problems with the European Union. I mean, there's a long list of problems with the EU. One of them was its worship of the precautionary principle, its risk aversion, and its the closure of European borders to anything that it considered to have too many pesticides or to be insufficiently safe. And, it was always an overly risk averse institution, very sclerotic, very wrapped up in red tape. That was one of the problems with it. But I think the sausages story, it sounds frivolous, but it's actually very, very serious, because what it demonstrates very clearly is that the Northern Ireland Protocol compromises British sovereignty, because we have a situation where we can't move chilled meats from one part of our nation to another. It might sound ridiculous, it's only chilled meat and all that kind of stuff, but that's very serious. We don't have control over some of the goods and products and that we can move within our own borders. And I think this really gets to the heart of the problem with the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is why I think the government was wrong to sign up to it in the first place, which is it does leave a part of the UK partly in the European Union, partly bound to the European Union. And that's caused a lot of anger, understandably, in Northern Ireland. And I think it does represent almost an attempt to annex Northern Ireland by the EU and to weaken the spirit of Brexit, which was to restore democracy and sovereignty across the United Kingdom. I think what happened over the Brexit period is that the European Union, the Remainer elites, and increasingly the White House, they used Ireland and Irish concerns as a bit of a weapon against Brexit. So they constantly talked up the problems of Ireland, the problems of a hard border, the possibility that violence will return if we don't allow Northern Ireland to stay partially in European Union rules. They did all of this stuff. They constantly scaremongered. They exploited Ireland to weaken British democracy. And I think that had a devastating impact on Anglo-Irish relations, which have improved enormously over the past 30 years. And it really did actually chip away at Brexit. I think we have to ditch the Northern Ireland Protocol. I know that's extreme, but I think that would be more in keeping with the vote for Brexit than the situation we have at the moment.
James, what's your take on it? I mean, in some ways, these are headlines straight out of a Yes Minister episode, right? The Great British Banger, all of that sort of stuff. But as Brendan rightly says, that sort of makes it sound trivial, doesn't it? But it's not really just about the Great British Banger. Are you worried this is the first little lighting of a touch paper of a UK-EU trade war?
I'm sure that your script has got all kinds of great puns ready for this.
Who will bring home the bacon, James? That's what we want to know.
I think the best I've seen is one describing Ireland as being in the worst Kaiser scenario. That was the worst I've seen so far on that one. But it's, first of all, how good it is that we're now finally out of an organisation that has to put in protective laws and things to protect its European domestic turkey Twizzler producers. How ridiculous that is. And I think that Brendan probably is onto something with the idea that this protocol is not going to last very long. I suspect people inside government thought that it might last until the first kind of sort of almost plebiscite that would be on it for both people inside Northern Ireland to vote on. And Lord Frost and his team, who are excellent on this, and they're the ones that got us out of the EU, frankly, and out of that transition period in the first place, will be all over the detail and the various options and things like that. If we can get over this little hurdle, then finally that team and the rest of the government as well can start looking at all the exciting prospects that are to be had. And I suppose maybe to continue the food analogy, it's like making a child eat all of their vegetables before they get onto the sort of fun stuff of the sausages or whatever. Because once that team can deal with all these problems, then we can start really exploiting all of the wonderful opportunities of Brexit. And this point about the domestic chilled meat European market, that stuff will all have been ported over into UK law when we ported all of the sort of EU laws over. And think if that's there on the UK statute, how many other stupid, pointless regulations we'll be able to strip out over the coming years. I know it's illegal to import grapes now with the idea of making them into wine at the moment because French wine producers are such protectionists. That's now on the UK statute books for no real reason. And so once we get over this hurdle, there'll be so many exciting opportunities. And as we've seen with vaccine buying that Kate Bingham managed to do, people will start seeing the Brexit dividend more and more as the 20s roll on.
James, stay with us. I've got a final question for Brendan and Victoria before they depart. Brendan, let me start with you. How can we unravel this protocol? What should we do, to make sure that things don't flare up in Ireland, where you rightly say, things have been, in historical terms, very good for a number of decades now. But having signed all of this and locked it in, what's the means of extracting ourselves from these rules or arrangements in a satisfactory way that allows free trade to flow between mainland Britain and Northern Ireland, but does so within some sort of unanimously agreed legal framework rather than us creating perennial tensions, whether they're about sausages or anything else?
Well, I think it's going to be a difficult process. It's not going to be like ripping off a plaster. It's going to be hard, whatever we do. I think probably the medium-term or long-term consequence of whatever we do will be an Irish border poll. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about what happens on the island of Ireland over the next few decades. That's all going to come into play. I think we should welcome that. It will enliven political debate. There'll be political discussion. There'll be opportunities for more democracy and more discussion as well. So all of that's going to happen. I think that's kind of inevitable because Northern Ireland was always a slightly odd attachment to Great Britain. Having said that, this is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the European Union, who we rejected unanimously with a very, very large vote, is now still has some say over what happens in Northern Ireland. That's simply unacceptable. So I think we need to push the government, in fact, not simply to try to accommodate EU concerns or push back against little things like the chilled meat situation and so on. We have to push the government to have a serious reckoning with the Northern Ireland Protocol in the round and to ask questions about whether it's a useful protocol, whether it's going to undermine British sovereignty. But my preference, because I have a bit of a revolutionary instinct, is just to sign it, just ditch it overnight. I would get rid of it straight away. But that will be difficult. That will be difficult.
Yeah. Victoria, we all know that the proof of the black pudding is in the eating, right? So we managed to shoehorn one other in. But how do we extract from this? Is it just unilateral action? Just say we shouldn't have signed that. We're going to kind of swerve what we actually agreed to. Both sides, of course, in this dispute have said a horribly overused term by politicians of all stripes that they'll do whatever it takes to resolve the situation. What does that mean? What would doing whatever it takes to resolve it mean, Victoria, and allowing, no doubt, both sides to save face, right?
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult one. I very, very sincerely wish the protocol wasn't there. I wish Theresa May hadn't agreed to what she agreed to in 2017 in the joint report that set all of this in motion by making certain concessions that, the EU, once they latched onto that, were never going to let go, and here we are. I don't think it's realistic to simply unilaterally withdraw from it. I think the knock-on effects of that would be very serious. And I think potentially David Frost and his team are getting it about right and working with what they have in front of them, taking unilateral action where necessary to protect fundamental requirements such as the import of fresh food into Northern Ireland. I think it's perfectly valid to take unilateral action in those cases and just try and soften it and make it work as best we can with as light touch as possible until the Northern Ireland Assembly gets to vote on it in 2024, I think. And then again, that vote itself might not be that conclusive, because that won't necessarily, even if they vote against it, it won't necessarily result in the protocol being thrown out. It would probably just trigger another round of negotiations. So I'm afraid, for the people of Northern Ireland, especially business people and indeed the consumers who suffer most when their costs go up and their choice is reduced, I'm afraid we are in this for the long haul.
The Irish problem in one size, shape or form and in lots of different ways seems always to be with us. Victoria and Brendan, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this week's Live with Littlewood. Always a pleasure to have you. James, stay with us. I think you can stay with us for a few more minutes. I'm just going to introduce our last two guests on this week's show. Delighted to be joined by Christian Calgie, senior reporter at the Guido Fawkes website, and our very own IA's Alexander Hammond, who, as well as working for the IAA, is the director of the Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity. Good evening to both of you. Christian, lovely to see you. What do you make of the banger wars? Is this a flippant minor problem, or is this going to explode into something quite nasty?
Well, I think the last time I was on this show, I mentioned that my main concern was over what was brewing in Northern Ireland, and unfortunately we've seen that continue and grow and escalate. It is clearly a problem, and I was listening to what was being said before, and I remember what the SNP were saying throughout the negotiations were that they were accusing Northern Ireland of being in the best of both worlds, and why couldn't Scotland enjoy that particular sort of half in, half out arrangement? Well, thank goodness the UK government prevented the SNP from wreaking that havoc north of the border, because it is clearly completely unsustainable, and it has to be a top priority. And I think it would have, exploded a lot sooner had the pandemic not come along, which obviously parked all of these sort of domestic issues. And now they've got to work at full pace. But I do not believe the EU have the best of intentions when it comes to Northern Ireland. And if I were Boris Johnson, if I were in number 10, I wouldn't be expecting them really to negotiate in good faith, because they've used Northern Ireland as something to levy extra concessions from the UK throughout the last 4 years. And I don't think they're going to stop anytime soon.
Alex, you're a bright guy, and I've given you 2 minutes to think about it. You must have the solution to the Northern Ireland problem, haven't you? What is it?
Almost there. Give me 30 more seconds. So I think it's a weird situation we're in. The EU says the UK signed up to a protocol, therefore we need to make it work. But the UK argues, on the other hand, no, the protocol is unworkable, and then blames the EU implementation as making it more difficult. And obviously in the EU's dreamland, we're just aligning our food standards with them. But then that creates a problem. Imagine the signal that sends to all the dozens of countries we're doing free trade agreements with. But then if the EU allows concessions and for there to be fewer checks, as it were, that creates a really bad signal to other countries outside of the EU they do checks with. So who knows? Give me 30 more seconds and maybe I'll have it, Mark.
Well, nearly there. James, I know you've got to leave us shortly. Can you give a crack at this intractable problem? What would your solution be, James?
It's something like when Palmerston tried to describe the Schleswig-Holstein issue and said there are only 3 people who could work it out, and one of them was him and he'd forgotten, and one was dead and one was mad. Maybe that's Alex and Christian and I. The thing is with the European Union, when it wants to find a solution to these things, it finds a solution. And when it wants to find a problem, it finds a problem. And when it wants to find a problem, that's because it can make some kind of political hay out of it. And when it knows that it's in trouble, and I don't mean the people of Europe in trouble, it's not about their prosperity that the organisation seems to care about. When the project itself is in trouble and its general integrity, then they'll throw people under the bus for it. And I do kind of feel for Ireland. They've sort of probably overplayed their hand a little bit, the Republic of Ireland this is, and the European Union has exploited them and used them and bounced them into various things. And the solution that is being floated this morning was that Ireland were going to end up with the worst of both worlds, really that first case of scenario we mentioned just now. I think that's very difficult. And I think that Lord Frost's team understand the way that the European commissioners think about this sort of problem. It's not about the welfare of the people on the ground. They say they care perhaps about the troubles and the past of that. I'm not really sure that that's true, whereas it's a very, very acute issue for the British government to make sure we get this right. And therefore, I really hope they prevail.
What do you think of my solution, James, that we actually have a united Ireland that rejoins the United Kingdom, right? I mean, that would be universally popular. I can't see anybody opposing that. That's the kind of, actually in a strict economic, a pure economist, I think would argue for that though, right? Most of the Republic's trade is, or a large chunk of it is with the UK. Do you think that's where we might end up, or am I in complete fantasy land, James?
The United Kingdom is probably the most successful country in the world in all kinds of different metrics. And I think there should be more people who want to be British, whether that's the best and brightest from around the world, which we can now change our policies to allow that now we're outside the European Union. And if Ireland chooses to do that, then fantastic. I'm not the biggest Guinness fan in the world, but I'm sure that I can make that kind of concession for our, hopefully once again, British brothers and sisters.
James, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you, my friend. Look forward to catching up with you soon. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Christian, let me come back to you. Our earlier guests were saying, Brendan O'Neill in particular, that he suspects that this sort of Irish issue problem, in this case brought about by the Northern Ireland Protocol, will be with us for some considerable time. Victoria was sort of, I think, saying, it's about 5 years away before we might be able to have a vote that might be able to reopen negotiations. Do you think we've had, over the past couple of decades or so, we've had a pretty decent period of peace in Northern Ireland? Do you think the future of Ireland could be a fairly dominating feature in UK politics for many years ahead, especially given the question of Scotland's potential independence from the Union?
Yeah, exactly. I think these things flow from various narratives that the media get latched onto, and as soon as Scotland becomes a question, then all of a sudden many people here in Westminster realise that there's also that thorny issue of Northern Ireland, and it's never been more acute. And you're right, the level of peace that was enjoyed in Northern Ireland for those, the first couple of decades of this millennium were special, and they were rare, and it was sort of, you don't realise what you've got until you've lost it. But ultimately, this debate, in a way, was almost never going to go away. The reality is that throughout the Brexit negotiations, if you boiled it down to its most basic options, you either had a united kingdom which had a harder border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, or you had a softer border between Northern Ireland and the Republic that then incurred checks going between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. That's what dominated Theresa May's negotiations. She was ultimately more wedded to the Union than her own political career, and Boris Johnson realised that, in the short term of getting it through Parliament and getting a deal signed and selling it to the public, that sort of selling Northern Ireland down the river a bit was the political gamble, and it could hopefully be resolved afterwards. We were always heading to this situation. It's come slightly earlier than expected, and Boris Johnson's made his bed, and now he's got to work out how to lie in it.
Alex, what's your thought? Do you think that British public discourse and political debate could actually just continue to be dominated by constitutional questions? There was a lot of economics, obviously, in Brexit, but ultimately a constitutional question. Do we now think we're going to have years of constitutional wrangling, not about the European Union and our relationship with it, but about our own union, Scotland and Northern Ireland and the rest of it? Are we going to have years of tedious, tormenting introspection, do you fear, Alex?
Well, perhaps. I guess that's one of the problems of not having the continuous constitutional problems comes from not having a written constitution. I'm a big fan of the American model. I lived there for a couple of years, and even though I guess it's not entirely stuck to over there, I think it's good for libertarians as well to know exactly what the government can and can't do. And when that's instilled into you at a very young age, If you ask all Americans of the Bill of Rights, they're able to tell you. And perhaps in the UK, that's part of the issue of our relationship with government. If you ask a normal person on the street, they can't tell you what is an acceptable role of government, or how big should a government, how big should it be, what can it and can't it do to infringe upon an individual. So perhaps, yes, and perhaps the solution to that is to have an actual written constitution like our friends across the oceans.
We could go on for hours on that. That's, I know for sure, another topic that splits IA type people, but so thanks for lobbing that grenade in, Alex. I want to move on to our last topic of this week's show. We're calling this Trade, Not Aid. I think there's a number of interesting things happening. We've got the G7 obviously gathering in Cornwall. Separately to that, we've had this, it was rather sort of cut off at the knees rebellion against the government's plan to get themselves off the hook at the 0.7% international aid target. I'm going to be asking you, gents, whether or not whether you are remotely confident that the G7 or indeed the UK has found anything like the right way to tackle global poverty. We seem to be obsessing about unifying our corporation tax rates. A good chunk of Conservative MPs, and it's worth saying not always the usual suspects, seem to be determined to try and get the government onto spending right up to that 0.7% target. Obviously, you get a lot of stories about international aid, how horrifically wasted it all is. I've got an example here. £6 million from the international aid budget went to a Chinese research unit that focused on reducing the amount of salt housewives add while cooking. We've also seen £130,000, not a whole heap of money, but it all adds up, was spent researching the acceptability and feasibility of taxing sugary drinks. And in Colombia, £1 million was spent helping to tighten tobacco control laws. Christian, are you of the view that all of the money is wasted, or should we be a bit skeptical about those scare stories? Maybe even if half of it is wasted, if the other half sort of gets through and keeps people alive, is there any case for the international aid budget at all?
Well, if we focus on, if we accepted the premise that international aid was necessary, and we look at how it's actually being spent, I think there are two strands of major eyebrow raisers. There are the specific examples of ridiculous waste, which you've just detailed, and there obviously are, chronicles worth of examples. There's also the issue of what countries deserve the aid. And as we often argue at Guido, should countries that have the finances to have nuclear weapons or a space program, or they can find the money for those projects, but then they require the West and Britain to support charitable programs and welfare programs, is that fair or logical or sound? I would argue that is a very mixed bag. For example, I would not be feeling particularly charitable towards China at the moment. However, there's a very strong counter-argument to be made that if those funds were focused on pro-liberty, pro-democracy outlets, then that would be a good use of taxpayers' money. But it feeds in again to this whole thing of waste, which is almost, you get the sense that once the money's left the country, once the FCDO, as it now is, formerly DFID, sign the check and it leaves the borders, that's it. And it's just, there's these billions are being signed away and there's no actual line-by-line scrutiny back here at home, because the aid budget is so large that is almost an unfeasible task for elected representatives to get on with, and it's built in essentially to how foreign aid works.
Alex, I wanted to get you on this week's Live with Littlewood because you've recently set up this fantastic new initiative, the Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity, IATP. We'll make sure we put a link to that in the YouTube chat and in the show notes below. So you're trying to encourage trade, not just within Africa as a way of getting out of poverty, but from Africa to other parts of the world. I want to come to trade in a minute, but on the aid side of the equation, tell me, I think one of your partner organizations in the IATP includes an organization in Burundi, the world's poorest nation. How do places like Burundi look upon international development aid? Welcome it with open arms? Or are some of the points that Christian's made about displacement, misallocation of resources and waste what comes to the front of their minds when these checks or crates or whatever it is start rolling into their country?
Yes, I was talking to some Burundian partners just last week, and aid came up, and surprisingly they're more against it than I am. When it comes to aid, I look at the data, I look at the works of William Eastley. I'm broadly against it. I admit sometimes it can be okay. Typically the times that it is successful are in things like the Green Revolution back in the 70s, smallpox, malaria, bed nets, which malaria has halved in the last 19 or so years, malaria deaths in Africa anyway. So medical interventions tend to be more successful, but I think that's because doctors often kind of quite literally have the exact prescription of what needs to be done rather than well-meaning economists. But when I talked to my friends in Burundi last week and the issue of aid came up, what they said is very quick to point out is the main problem with it is accountability. Both aid organizations are accountable to donors, and then governments that receive aid are accountable to the aid organizations. So there's no accountability to the people, which means, therefore, in that sense, it's unsurprising that the World Bank found that they did a study between 1975 and 2000, that there was no evidence that aid promoted things like democracy worldwide. And in fact, it had actually been used to finance some of the world's most unsavory regimes. And I think Paul Collier over at Oxford University estimated about 40% of Africa's military spending is inadvertently financed by aid. And I think the best example of that, especially for the UK, is Ethiopia. Ethiopia has always been one of our top, or not always, in the last decade or two, has always been one of our top aid recipients. But now right now it's bombing its own citizens. It's in the civil war. Thousands have been killed. 2 million have been forced out of their homes. And the US is accused of ethnic cleansing. And it's a tragic story, but it tends to be what happens is if you give aid to a lot of countries, they then can finance other things. And the World Bank did this not too long ago. They paid for a Chad-Cameroonian pipeline, $180 million. And then they said to Chad, you have to pledge, spend it on education and hospitals and things like that. Chad said, okay, we'll do. And then the World Bank admitted that in the first payment they got, they spent it on the army. That's a classic story.
Christian, let me ask you a slightly geeky kind of constitutional point about this, that I'm highly skeptical that international aid really works. I'm even more skeptical that it's the best available tool for lifting people out of poverty. I don't think it is at all. I think it's potentially a last resort. And I don't think you should have spending targets as a proportion of GDP for anything, whether that's international aid. Some people argue we should have a 2% defense, commitment on GDP. I think you should spend what you need to on defense. Might be more than 2%, might be less. But you might, if you're a constitutional purist, argue that the 0.7% target was indeed in the Conservative Party manifesto. It is indeed enshrined in law. And yet the the government seems to be acting in a way that, well, too bad, we're swerving that one. Parliament's not going to have its say. The Northern Ireland Protocol, we seem to be acting unilaterally on as well. I don't want to come across as an absolute pedant on this, but the rule of law doesn't seem to mean a whole deal to this government. Is that a fair criticism?
Well, on this, the aid question, it's not a fair criticism at all, because as we wrote in November 2020, we actually dug out the International Development Act of 2015, which specifically says that the government is allowed to implement a temporary aid cut for a period of around a year, and all it has to do is explain why it's done it to Parliament, and it specifically cites that fiscal circumstances, and if they are likely to impact the meeting of the target on taxation, public spending and public borrowing. So that is cut and dry. So all these MPs who were lining up yesterday to say that the fact that you link it to GDP accounts for downturns in economic conditions, etc., they actually forget that, yes, that is one of the mechanisms, but there was also a specific mechanism to allow the government to move away from the 0.7% for short intervals if they wanted to.
You've put the constitutional nerd pedantry side of my mind to rest there, Christian. I want to turn, gentlemen, to the other side of the equation. We're calling this section trade, not aid. I should declare I sit on the Strategic Trade Advisory Group for the Department of International Trade. I've been quite impressed. I mean, I'd always like to see more and faster, but the Trade Department's efforts under Liz Truss, Secretary of State, to actually get trade deals signed. Some of them are legacy carryovers, but there seems to be a determination to spread these around the world. I think we could probably do a bit more unilaterally. I don't think trade necessarily always hinges on the need for a trade deal that can actually that can help trade, but it's not an absolute prerequisite. Alex, this is the fulcrum of your new initiative, is to triumph and explain the benefits of trade. Supposing we went down a free trade route to try and pull countries in Africa and elsewhere in the world out of poverty, what would that look like, as opposed to arguments about 0.7% targets and where does the money go? And how beneficial can it be? Give us a sense of the trajectory we could get if we just saw considerably more free trade and many fewer barriers erected by rich nations, preventing poorer nations getting their products or services to market here.
Yeah, well, I think the best way to view that is if we look at, say, the African Continental Free Trade Area. If the World Bank's predicted, if it goes through, and its aim is for 97% of tariffs on just African countries to be removed, and they can trade almost freely within each other. The World Bank says within about 20 years, it will add $500 billion to the continent's economy, boost wages by about 10%, and lift about 30 million people out of extreme poverty and about 70 million people out of moderate poverty. That's what happens if Africa just trades with itself. Africa accounts for about 2% of global GDP. So imagine if we times that out by 50, the benefits can be absolutely enormous. And when it comes to how our aid contribution versus our trade contribution, I think, Mark, I've worked for you for a couple of years. So I know football analogies are best.
We haven't had one on the show yet, so do me a football analogy, Alex.
Very good. I think Western governments kind of like to think themselves as giving aid to governments as they're the manager of the poorer nation's football team, assisting them, yelling tactics at them on how they can win their match against poverty. But in reality, our aid contribution is pretty small. It's just a fraction of the amount of, say, Africa's GDP. They receive many times more from remittances and direct investment. So I think in reality, rather than being a manager, Western governments giving aid is far more like an inefficient ball boy. Sometimes we can respond well and get the ball back on the pitch when it goes off. Sometimes we don't and disrupt play for a little while, but either way, our role is relatively insignificant when it comes to aid.
Alex, we'll have you back on next week. I love highly contorted football analogies, and I can see you prepped that one pretty well. Christian, you guys are Guido Fawkes, I think, are pretty impressed by Liz Truss's efforts on getting trade deals signed. As kind of an area of this government that does seem to elicit applause from people of a free market persuasion. Do you think, though, we should pivot a bit, not just to this is good for business, this is good for British consumers, but as an actual anti-poverty strategy? If we started to allow products into our market from these poorer areas, as Alex says, you're exploding the market for them. And do you feel that perhaps we haven't done enough, even unilaterally, on that? One of the tariffs I noticed on the UK tariff schedule, I can't remember the percentage tariff it was now, but it was high, and it was on bananas. Now, I don't favour tariffs on anything, basically. I think I'm a complete global free trader. But I can understand when you potentially politically why you impose a tariff on something if you have a domestic producer. You're protecting your domestic producer. I don't approve of that, but I understand the politics of it. I don't know how many banana producers there are in the United Kingdom. Not a vast number, I would suggest. So absolutely absurd to have tariffs on bananas. Surely anything that we don't produce, we should just unilaterally remove. And rather than just celebrate, well, that's great, we can eat cheaper bananas, shouldn't we, Christian, also celebrate this, as Alex is with his new initiative, as probably the best anti-poverty mechanism that we have at our disposal?
I completely agree. And I think it would be a very sensible thing if the government looked down the list of all the tariffs and thought, well, you know, we don't have that many domestic banana growers or pineapple tree, farmers, get rid of them. And actually, yes, let's adjust the mechanism. Let's get rid of this 0.7% and have a more holistic thing where we cheer, just as loudly at seeing, a farmer in Africa seeing a boost to their business because they can export more easily to the UK, as we do when we sign a check to, a charity in the Middle East. And I think it would have been a fascinating experiment when the Department for International Trade was wrapped up, if it had been moved to the Department for Trade rather than the Foreign Office, because I think by putting DFID into the FCO, essentially a mission statement from the government that said it's more about diplomacy and it's more about sort of how Britain looks and is responded to on a world stage. Whereas really, as I think we all agree, the main purpose should be about benefiting entrepreneurs and people abroad as well as domestic consumers, which is really the remit of the Department for Trade and not the Foreign Office.
Alex, let me go to you for the final word, where I'm hoping you're going to slot the ball in the back of the net on this one. Are you of the view that we should merge together how we think about aid, whether it's 0.7% or occasional emergency relief, dovetail that into our trade efforts? And what would you like to see the UK do unilaterally to assist African men and women businesses in actually accessing our markets to mutual benefit? We get cheaper, higher quality goods. They get a much higher income.
Yeah, I'd like to say first, I completely like and love Christian's idea on the putting Department for International Development into the Department for Trade. That would have been superb. But I think the final note is we just need to realize that even though aid does sound good and that we should use it in times of emergency, but even then we should be careful. A lot of aid given to Haiti after their earthquake disrupted a lot of local industries. We should remember that at the end of the day, the World Bank and the IMF have admitted many times that the World Bank has admitted that about a third of aid fails to ever reach its final destination. The IMF has said that aid inflows have an adverse effect on the recipient country's competitiveness. A lot of it is quite damaging, and I know it feels good and nice and fluffy to give money to people who are less well off than ourselves. But it's about time we start treating them as equals, and there's no better way of doing that than through trade. As I said, I told you the benefits of the African Continental Free Trade Area, about $500 billion extra in their GDP in 20 years. Well, the UK's economy is the size of Africa, GDP terms. So let's double that. Let's do a free trade agreement with as many African countries as possible and get that up to $1 trillion instead of $500 billion.
On that upbeat, optimistic note, gentlemen, we're out of time. Christian, thank you so much for joining us again.
Yes.
Alex, always good to see you. Catch up with you in the next day or two too. Thanks very much for joining us. My thanks too to my earlier guests, Victoria Hewson, Brendan O'Neill and James Price. Just a couple of advertisements and thanks to finish with. Why not come to our Think conference this Saturday, June the 12th. It's a virtual conference. There are free tickets, but you need to register if you'd want to come. Whole range of interesting speakers, from Tim Harford to Vince Cable to Ruth Kelly, Matthew McCaffrey. There's going to be a trailer at the end of this broadcast to tell you a little bit more about it. And you can find more information in the show notes and on the promotional video at the end of the closing credits. On Monday, the 14th of June, I will be in conversation with the singer, songwriter, comedian, author, journalist, writer, and all-round good guy, libertarian polymath, Dominic Frisby. He's also a massive fan of Bitcoin. That's on Monday, the 14th of June on this very channel. Please join us for that. A special thank you to all of you, the viewers, but a particular thanks to our online patrons who generously fund our work, our VIP online patrons, James Burns, Mark Edwards and Timothy Worrell. Thanks very much. Thanks to all of the rest of you who have generously supported our work. Please go to patreon.com/IEA London if you're willing to do likewise. Stay safe, stay free, have a good evening, have a good week. Over and out.
Inspiring, informative, dynamic, diverse,
entertaining, liberalism,
challenging,
disruption,
futuristic.
So, how is politics at the moment? Well, it's a total mess.
Modern economics should become humanomics.
If you really want to tackle a problem, rather than thinking about things, what you've got to do is be part of the solution.
The whole point of Think is to question everything you think you know.
Ideas around liberty, free markets, freedom of speech.
Are you left or are you right? It's not a black and white distinction anymore.
I don't think anyone would disagree that we're in the midst of a free speech crisis.
People that want to understand economics and how does it impact within society.
You people, very few of you, will have the old school job for life.
I'm an optimist, and I don't think we've seen anything in terms of the progress that's coming.
I hope to make one or two people question their assumptions.
Something that's going to challenge the opinion that I already have.